My town exiled one family a year to maintain our perfect reputation. I was 13 when my best friend's family was chosen. Their name echoed through the town hall, and everyone stepped away from them like they were contaminated. His mother started sobbing. "Please, we've lived here for 3 generations." The council leader shook his head. "The vote has been cast. You have 24 hours to leave. Anyone caught helping you pack or say goodbye will join you." They weren't allowed to take anything except clothes. Their house, cars, bank accounts, everything became community property. The sheriff's department surrounded their home to make sure no one approached. I watched through my window as my best friend loaded garbage bags of clothes into their beat-up van the town allowed them to keep. He looked at my house and waved. I ducked below the window, too scared to wave back. That night I couldn't stop shaking. "What if we're chosen next?" I asked my father. "Then we leave with nothing," he said. "Now stop talking about it." Every year when the exile vote approached, I'd have panic attacks. The whole town would gather in the hall where each family cast anonymous votes for who should leave. The family with the most votes was gone within 24 hours. They called it maintaining community standards. When I was 15, they chose the Hendersons because their son was caught smoking weed. Mr. Henderson begged on his knees. "It was just marijuana. He's a good kid." "Drug use threatens our reputation," the council leader said. "The vote stands." Mrs. Dabber Henderson had cancer and needed treatments only available at our local hospital. It didn't matter. They were gone by morning, and 2 weeks later, we heard she died in some charity ward 3 states away. My older sister fell in love with Johnry, whose family ran the bakery. They were planning their future together when his family name got called. Johnry's father had been caught gambling online, a moral failure that could infect others. "Please," Johnry begged my sister in front of everyone, "come with me." But leaving voluntarily meant you could never return, never contact anyone, never inherit anything. My sister just cried as they dragged Johnry away. She stopped eating after that, stopped talking, just stared at nothing until my parents sent her to a facility. When I turned 17, I started noticing patterns. The 5 founding families, the ones who owned the major businesses, sat on the council, controlled the voting system. They never got chosen. Never. In 50 years of exiles, not one founding family member had left. "How do they never get voted out?" I asked my mother quietly. Her face went pale. "Stop asking questions." But I kept watching. The council collected the ballots in a locked box only they could access. They counted votes in private. They announced results with no verification. It wasn't a vote. It was a selection disguised as democracy. 3 months later, they called our name. My mother collapsed. "We've done everything right. We've never caused trouble." The council leader smiled coldly. "The community has spoken." Later, I learned why. My father had been promoted at the factory over a founding family member's son. We were competition now. We had to go. As we packed our clothes in trash bags, neighbors watched from windows, but no one helped. 20 years of friendships meant nothing. My girlfriend wouldn't even look at me. The sheriff gave us an old van with just enough gas to reach the county line. "Don't come back," he said. "Ever." We drove away with nothing. No money, no home, no future. My mother cried the entire drive. My father stared straight ahead, broken. Everything we'd built was gone because we'd threatened the wrong people's power. But at the county line, something strange happened. Another car was waiting, then another, then 10 more. They were all exiled families from previous years. They'd been watching, waiting, planning. "Welcome to the real community," one said, "the one where people actually help each other." They'd built their own town 40 miles away. Better schools, real democracy, actual justice. Every family the old town threw away had made something better. But they were planning something else too. They'd been documenting everything. The rigged votes, the stolen property, the deaths caused by exile. The FBI was building a case. The founding families had been committing fraud, theft, and manslaughter for 50 years. "We're going back," the leader said, "but not as exiles, as prosecutors." The man who'd spoken stepped forward and held out his hand to my father. "I'm Eli Napier. We've been watching the county line for 8 years now, waiting for families like yours." My father just stared at the offered hand like he didn't understand what it meant anymore. Mom was still crying in the passenger seat, her face buried in her hands. I sat in the back, surrounded by garbage bags of our clothes, trying to process what was happening. These people were here for us. They'd been waiting. "We know what you're going through," Eli said, his voice calm and steady. "We've all been through it. Every single one of us got thrown out just like you did." He gestured to the other cars lined up behind him, maybe 10 or 15 vehicles with people standing beside them. "We built something better 40 miles from here. A real town where people actually help each other instead of stabbing each other in the back." My father finally took Eli's hand and shook it, but he didn't say anything. He couldn't. I could see his jaw working like he was trying to form words, but nothing would come out. "Follow us," Eli said. "We've got a place ready for you. Food, clothes, everything you need tonight. You're not alone anymore." The convoy of cars pulled out, and we followed them down the highway, our beat-up van rattling and shaking. Mom kept crying but quieter now, and Dad gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. I watched the other cars ahead of us and tried to understand what this meant. These people had survived exile. They'd built something new. Maybe we could survive too. The drive took almost an hour, and with every mile I felt something shifting inside me. Not hope exactly, more like the tiniest crack in the wall of panic that had been crushing my chest since they called our name in the town hall. We turned off the highway onto a smaller road, then onto a dirt path that wound through some trees. When we came out the other side, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was an actual town, not some sad collection of trailers and tents like I'd pictured in my head. Real houses lined both sides of a paved street. A school building sat on one corner, 2 stories tall with windows that actually had glass in them. A community center took up a whole block, bigger than anything in our old town except the factory. Streetlights lined the roads. Gardens grew in front yards. Kids' bikes lay in driveways. This wasn't a refugee camp. This was a functioning place where people lived normal lives. How did they build all this? I asked, but my parents didn't answer. They were both staring out the windshield with the same shocked expression I probably had on my face. Eli's car pulled up in front of a mobile home that looked newer than the house we'd just lost. He got out and waited for us, and slowly my father turned off the engine. We all just sat there for a minute, nobody moving. "Come on," Eli called, walking up to the van. "Let me show you your new place." We climbed out and followed him up 3 steps to the front door. He unlocked it and gestured for us to go inside. The mobile home was furnished. A couch and chairs in the living room. A table with 4 chairs in the kitchen area. Curtains on the windows. Dishes in the cabinets. The fridge was stocked with food, actual groceries like milk and eggs and bread and lunch meat. The closets had clothes hanging in them, different sizes for all of us. The bathroom had towels and soap and shampoo. Someone had made up the beds with clean sheets. My mother walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge, then just stood there looking at all the food inside. Her shoulders started shaking, and she made this sound like something broke inside her chest. But this crying was different from the crying in the van. She turned around and looked at Eli with tears running down her face. "Why are you helping us? You don't even know us." Eli smiled, and it was the first genuine smile I'd seen in what felt like years. "Because people helped us when we got exiled. And before that, people helped them. That's how this works. We take care of each other because nobody else will." My father walked over to the couch and sat down heavily, still not saying a word. He put his face in his hands, and his whole body went rigid, like he was trying to hold himself together through pure force. I stood in the middle of the living room with my hands in my pockets, feeling like I'd walked into some alternate reality where things actually made sense. "Get some rest tonight," Eli said. "Tomorrow morning I'll bring my son Rodrigo over to meet you. He's about your age." He looked at me when he said it. "He can show you around, introduce you to the other kids. You're not the only teenagers here who've been through this." After Eli left, we just stood there in the mobile home not knowing what to do with ourselves. Mom started unpacking the garbage bags of clothes, hanging things in closets like we were going to stay here, like this was real. Dad stayed on the couch staring at nothing. I went into what was apparently my bedroom and lay down on the bed. The sheets smelled like laundry detergent. The pillow was soft. Through the thin walls, I could hear my mother crying again in her room, these quiet sobs that went on and on. My father's silence felt even worse somehow. At least when Mom cried, I knew she was still feeling things. Dad had just shut down completely, like someone flipped a switch and turned off everything that made him who he was. I stared at the ceiling and thought about my best friend waving from his family's van 8 years ago. I'd been 13 and so scared that I ducked below my window instead of waving back. That memory had been eating at me for years, but tonight, it felt even heavier. I'd been a coward then, when it cost me nothing to be brave. Just one wave goodbye to show him I still cared. But I'd hidden instead. Now I was lying in a strange bed in a strange town, exiled just like he'd been, and I still didn't know if I could be brave when it actually mattered. The shame of that moment crashed over me again and again. I was 17 now, but I felt like that scared 13-year-old kid hiding below the window. What if I was still that same coward? What if exile didn't change anything about who I really was? I lay there listening to my mother cry and my father's terrible silence, and I wondered if any of us would ever be okay again. The next morning, Rodrigo showed up at our mobile home with a girl about my age. She had dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and wore jeans with holes in the knees and a faded t-shirt. She smiled when she saw me standing in the doorway, looking confused and tired. Rodrigo introduced her as Thea Harvey and explained her family got exiled 2 years ago. I nodded and tried to act normal, even though I felt like my brain was still foggy from everything that happened. Thea suggested we walk around the exile town so she could show me where everything was located. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing, and my father had already left with Eli to look at some construction project. I grabbed a jacket and followed Thea and Rodrigo outside. The morning air was cold, and I shoved my hands in my pockets as we walked down the street, past other mobile homes and small houses. Thea pointed out the community center where meetings happened and the school building where I'd be going starting tomorrow. She talked fast and made jokes about how the exile town didn't have a movie theater or a mall, but at least nobody pretended to be perfect here. I asked why her family got exiled, and she said her mom got pregnant outside marriage, which the old town called a moral failure. She laughed when she said it, but the laugh sounded bitter. Her mom had the baby, and now Thea had a little brother who was almost 2 years old. She said getting exiled was probably the best thing that ever happened to them, because her mom met someone nice here who actually wanted to be a father to the baby. We sat on a bench outside the community center, and Thea asked about my family's exile. I told her about my father's promotion and how we got targeted because we threatened the wrong people. She nodded like she understood completely. Then she said something that made me stop and think. She said maybe getting exiled saved us from turning into the kind of people who stayed in that town, the kind who watched families get destroyed and did nothing. I'd never thought about it that way before. We talked for hours about the old town and all the horrible things we'd seen happen there. Thea remembered when the Hendersons got exiled and how Mrs. and Henderson died 2 weeks later. She said her mom cried for days after hearing that news. We talked about how the founding families never were chosen and how everyone knew the votes were fake, but nobody said anything. Thea said fear makes people into cowards, and the old town ran on fear. Being around her felt strange because she wasn't destroyed by what happened to her family. She seemed almost happy here in the exile town. That confused me because I still felt broken and lost. After lunch, Rodrigo took me to meet Bridget Syons, who ran the exile community school. She was probably in her 50s with gray hair and kind eyes. She sat down with me in her small office and asked about my grades and what classes I'd been taking. I explained I was supposed to be a senior this year, and I needed to graduate on time. Bridget smiled and said that wouldn't be a problem. The school here was small, with only about 30 students total, but the teachers actually cared about helping kids learn. She said I could start tomorrow, and she'd make sure I stayed on track to graduate in the spring. I felt relieved hearing that because I'd been worried about falling behind. Bridget asked if I was okay, and I said I was fine, even though that was a lie. She looked at me carefully and said it was normal to feel numb and distracted after exile. She said having structure and routine would help my brain process everything. I nodded and tried to believe her. That afternoon, I saw my father for the first time since breakfast. He was at a construction site on the edge of the exile town, helping build a new house. Eli was there too, supervising the work. My father was hammering nails into boards with this mechanical precision, like his body knew what to do, even though his mind was somewhere else. He didn't look up when I walked over. Eli came over and explained that physical work was good for people who just got exiled. It gave them something to focus on besides all the loss and anger. He said my father needed purpose right now, even if it was just basic labor. I watched my father work and understood what Eli meant. Dad wasn't trying to build something meaningful or prove anything. He was just trying to survive each day without falling apart completely. The repetitive motion of hammering kept him from thinking too much. I wanted to talk to him, but I didn't know what to say, so I just stood there watching for a while before walking back to the mobile home. 2 weeks passed in a blur of school and trying to adjust to this new life. I went to classes at the Exile Community School and tried to focus on homework, even though my brain felt like static. Thea sat with me at lunch every day, and gradually I started feeling a little less numb. My mother spent most of her time in the mobile home crying or staring at nothing. Rosa visited her a few times trying to help, but Mom just couldn't seem to pull herself out of the darkness. One morning, I finally worked up the courage to ask Eli about my sister. She was still in the mental health facility near the old town, and we hadn't heard from her since our exile. I was terrified that she thought we abandoned her. Eli listened carefully and then made some phone calls. He found out my sister had been asking about us constantly and was scared we'd left her behind like everyone else did. Rosa helped arrange a phone call for that afternoon. When I heard my sister's voice on the phone, something broke open in my chest. She sounded so lost and scared. She kept asking if we were okay and where we were living and if we were coming back for her. I tried to explain about the exile and the new town, but she wasn't really listening. She just kept saying she was afraid we forgot about her. My mother took the phone and talked to my sister for almost an hour. When Mom hung up, she looked worse than before. She became obsessed with getting my sister transferred to a facility near the exile town so we could visit her regularly. Rosa warned this would be hard and expensive since we had no money or insurance now. The helplessness of not being able to help my sister ate at my mother. I watched her slip deeper into depression, despite all the support from the exile community. She stopped eating much and barely talked to anyone. Dad was still working construction every day and coming home too tired to deal with Mom's breakdown. I felt stuck between them both, not knowing how to help either one. Rodrigo must have noticed I was struggling because he invited me to hang out with the other exile teenagers one Saturday afternoon. About 15 kids showed up at the community center ranging from 13 to 19 years old. They were all surprisingly normal. They joked around and complained about homework and talked about crushes and argued about music and movies. Being around them helped me understand that exile didn't have to define everything about who we became. We could still be regular people, despite what was done to us. One kid named Johnry made everyone laugh telling stories about his terrible cooking attempts. A girl named Sarah talked about her college applications. Another guy complained about his annoying little brother. They'd all been through the trauma of exile, but they weren't letting it destroy them. After a few weeks, Wallace Holt approached me at the community center and asked if I wanted to help with documentation work for the FBI case. He explained they were recording every exiled family's story as evidence. I felt terrified thinking about reliving everything, but Rodrigo volunteered to sit with me during the interview. We went to a small office where Vaughn Tanner had computers and recording equipment set up. Vaughn was quiet and efficient, asking me questions while typing notes. I spent 3 hours telling him everything. I described the night my best friend's family got exiled when I was 13 and how I hid below the window instead of waving goodbye. I talked about watching the Hendersons beg before their exile and hearing about Mrs. Henderson's death 2 weeks later. I explained my sister's breakdown after Johnry got exiled and how she stopped eating and talking. I described noticing the founding family pattern and realizing the votes were rigged. Then I talked about our own exile and the terror of losing everything. Recording it all made it real in a new way. Saying the words out loud to someone who was writing them down as evidence made me understand the scale of what happened to us. Vaughn thanked me when we finished and said my testimony was valuable. Rodrigo walked back to the mobile home with me and didn't make me talk about it. A few days later, Agent Sebastian Donovan visited the exile town to meet with key witnesses. Eli brought me to the community center where the agent was interviewing people. Sebastian was probably in his 40s with gray hair and a serious expression. He shook my hand and thanked me for agreeing to talk with him. We sat down in a private room, and he explained exactly how the federal case worked. He said they were pursuing charges of fraud, theft, racketeering, and manslaughter against the founding families. He showed me documents and evidence they'd collected over 3 years. My testimony about noticing the founding family pattern was important because it proved the systematic nature of the corruption. For the first time, I understood this was really happening. The founding families would actually face consequences for what they'd done. Sebastian was professional and kind, explaining everything in detail. He said the case would take time, but they had strong evidence. When the interview ended, I felt something like hope starting to grow. That evening, I overheard my father talking with Wallace Holt on the porch of our mobile home. I stood inside near the door listening. Wallace was talking about rage and helplessness and wanting revenge. My father's voice sounded raw, admitting he fantasized about hurting the people who destroyed us. Wallace said he understood that feeling completely. But then he said revenge wasn't the goal. Justice was the goal, and it was more powerful because it was real and lasting. Revenge would just make us like them. Justice would actually hold them accountable. My father started crying, and it was the first time I'd heard him cry since our exile. Wallace didn't try to comfort him or tell him to stop. He just sat there in silence. Two men processing trauma together in the only way they knew how. Thea and I started spending more time together over the next few weeks. We'd walk around the exile town or sit at the community center talking. One afternoon, she asked about my girlfriend from the old town, the one who wouldn't look at me during our exile. I admitted it still hurt that someone I loved could turn away so easily. Thea said her boyfriend did the same thing when her family got exiled. He told her he loved her, but then acted like she didn't exist once the exile happened. We bonded over the betrayal of people who claimed to care about us, but only stuck around when it was easy and convenient. Thea reached over and took my hand. She said we were better off without people like that. People who only cared when there was no cost to caring. I looked at her and realized she was right. The exile had stripped away all the fake relationships and left only the real ones. The people here in the exile town actually helped each other because they understood what it meant to lose everything. That was worth more than all the shallow friendships back in the old town. A month passed in the exile town, and I fell into routines that almost felt normal. Then Eli called an emergency meeting at the community center, and everyone gathered quickly because urgent news from the old town always meant another family got destroyed. Eli stood at the front, looking tired and angry. He explained that a single mother named Jennifer and her 2 kids just got exiled because she reported safety problems at the factory where she worked. The founding families decided she threatened their business, so they voted her out within 24 hours. My stomach twisted, because I knew exactly what that family was going through right now. Eli organized a welcoming committee immediately and asked for volunteers. My hand went up before I even thought about it. Rosa started making phone calls to arrange temporary housing, and my mother began gathering donated clothes and supplies. 6 of us drove out to the county line that evening and waited in the same spot where cars had waited for my family. When Jennifer's beat-up truck appeared, she looked confused and scared seeing us there. Her 2 kids sat in the back seat with garbage bags of clothes just like I had. Eli approached her window and introduced himself gently. He explained we were all exiled families, and we built a community to help each other. Jennifer started crying, and her daughter, who looked about 12, asked if we were going to hurt them. That question broke something in my chest, because they'd been conditioned to expect cruelty from everyone now. I told them we just wanted to help, and we knew exactly what they were feeling. We led them back to the exile town, and I watched Jennifer's face change when she saw actual houses and paved streets instead of some desperate camp. Her son asked if this was real, and Rodrigo laughed, saying he'd asked the same thing when his family arrived. We got them settled in the mobile home my family had stayed in, and I helped the kids unpack their bags. The daughter kept looking at me like she was waiting for the trap to spring. I sat down and told her about hiding below my window when my best friend waved goodbye 5 years ago. I told her I understood being scared and confused and not knowing who to trust anymore. She asked if it got better, and I said yes, but slowly. Her brother was only 8 and kept asking when they could go home. Jennifer had to explain again that they couldn't ever go back, and watching her try to comfort her kids while falling apart herself reminded me of my own mother that first night. The next day, I took the kids to meet Bridget at the community school and helped them get enrolled. The daughter's name was Laura, and the son was called Jack. Laura was quiet and watchful, but Jack wouldn't stop talking because he processed fear by filling silence. Bridget was patient with both of them and explained how the school worked. Rodrigo met us there and joked that I was already becoming part of the Exile community's support system. He said I had the right experience to help scared kids adjust. The responsibility felt strange, but good, like I was finally doing something useful instead of just surviving. Laura and Jack were going through exactly what I went through, and I could actually help them in ways no one could help me back then. I showed them around the school and introduced them to other Exile kids. Laura asked if everyone here got thrown out of the old town, and I explained that every single person in this community lost everything the same way. Jack wanted to know if we were going to get revenge, and Rodrigo said something better than revenge: justice. Over the next week, I checked on Laura and Jack every day. Laura started opening up about how scared she was when the sheriff surrounded their house. Jack had nightmares about being dragged away from his friends. I listened and shared my own experiences, and slowly they started trusting that this place was safe. Jennifer thanked me one evening and said having someone who understood helped her kids more than she could. I told her the community saved my family, and now we all saved each other. My mother and Rosa started working together on a project that consumed all their energy. They were trying to raise money to transfer my sister from the facility near the old town to one closer to the Exile community. The transfer would cost thousands of dollars we didn't have, and insurance wouldn't cover it. Rosa made calls to every charity and aid organization she could find. My mother organized fundraisers within the Exile community, even though everyone here had almost nothing. I watched people who arrived with garbage bags of clothes donate $5 or $10 toward my sister's transfer. Wallace gave $50 and said he wished someone had helped his wife get treatment. The generosity overwhelmed me because these people understood loss in ways that made them more willing to help instead of less. Over 6 weeks, my mother and Rosa navigated endless red tape and bureaucratic nightmares. Every form required 3 more forms. Every approval needed 2 more approvals. My mother cried from frustration multiple times, but Rosa kept pushing forward with the stubborn determination of someone who knew how to fight systems. Finally, they got approval for the transfer and enough money to cover the costs. The facility near the Exile community had an opening, and my sister would move there within the week. My mother broke down crying with relief when Rosa called to tell her. I hugged my mother and felt the weight she'd been carrying start to lift. We could actually visit my sister now instead of just making phone calls. She wouldn't be alone and abandoned anymore. Our first visit to the new facility was hard in ways I didn't expect. My sister looked smaller and more fragile than I remembered. The medication made her movements slow and her eyes slightly unfocused. She was processing Johnry's exile and then our own disappearance, and she thought we abandoned her like everyone else did. My mother held her and promised we'd visit twice a week and we'd never leave her again. My sister cried and asked why we didn't come sooner. My mother explained about our own exile and the struggle to get her transferred. My sister looked at me and asked if I was okay. Even broken and medicated, she was still trying to take care of me. I told her I was surviving and asked how she was doing. She said the medication helped, but she still had bad days where she couldn't stop thinking about Johnry. She wanted to know if he was okay, and I had to admit, I didn't know where his family ended up. The therapist joined us and explained my sister's treatment plan and progress. She was stable, but still fragile, and needed consistent support. We promised to be there, and my sister grabbed my hand asking me not to disappear again. I swore I wouldn't, and meant it. On the drive back, my mother was quiet, but less tense than she'd been in months. My father said seeing my sister was hard but necessary. We were a family again, even if we were all damaged. Vaughn asked if I wanted to help with data entry for the FBI case, and I agreed immediately. The work involved organizing documents and testimony into searchable databases that prosecutors could use. Vaughn showed me the system and explained how each entry needed to be tagged and cross-referenced. I started reading through testimonies from exiled families, and the scale of cruelty became overwhelming. Every entry represented destroyed lives and stolen futures. I read about families torn apart and people who died because exile cut them off from medical care. The founding families had been doing this for 50 years, and the documentation proved systematic targeting of anyone who threatened their power. I spent hours at the computer entering data and seeing patterns emerge. They exiled business competitors and whistleblowers, and anyone who questioned their authority. The randomness I'd always assumed was actually calculated destruction. Vaughn noticed me getting tense and told me to take breaks when I needed them. I asked how he stayed calm reading all this, and he said anger was useful, but drowning in it wasn't. He channeled his rage into precise documentation that would put the founding families in prison. I tried to do the same, but some entries hit too hard. Reading about my best friend's family and the Hendersons and Johnry's family made my hands shake. Vaughn put his hand on my shoulder and said, taking breaks wasn't weakness. I stepped outside, and Rodrigo found me sitting on the steps. He didn't ask what was wrong, just sat next to me in silence. After a while, I went back inside and kept working, because this mattered more than my comfort. Thea noticed I was getting obsessed with the documentation work. I spent every free hour at the computer entering data and cross-referencing testimony. She showed up at the community center one afternoon and physically dragged me away from the desk. She said I needed to be a normal teenager for a few hours instead of drowning in other people's trauma. We drove to a nearby town neither of us had visited before. Thea picked a random movie playing at the theater, and we bought tickets without even checking what it was about. For 2 hours, I forgot about exile and corruption and justice. The movie was stupid and funny and completely meaningless. Afterward, we walked around the town looking in shop windows and eating ice cream. Thea talked about normal things like music and books and what she wanted to study in college. Being away from the exile community and the FBI case felt strange, but good. We drove back as the sun was setting, and Thea pulled into an empty parking lot. She turned to me and said she was glad we met, even though the circumstances were terrible. I agreed and said she made everything more bearable. She leaned over and kissed me, and it was the first genuinely good thing that happened since our exile. I was terrified of caring about someone again after watching my girlfriend turn away so easily. But Thea made it feel worth the risk, because she understood loss in ways that made her more loyal, not less. We sat in the car talking until it got dark, and she drove me back to the mobile home. I went inside feeling lighter than I had in weeks. My father slowly started emerging from his depression enough to attend community meetings. He didn't talk much at first, just sat in the back and listened. But gradually, he started contributing small ideas about the exile town's development. He suggested improvements to the water system and better organization for the community garden. Eli encouraged him and asked for his input on other projects. My father wasn't the confident man he was before our exile, but he was finding small ways to participate and rebuild his sense of purpose. I watched him talk with other exiled men about construction plans and saw tiny sparks of the person he used to be. One evening, Eli pulled me aside and said my father was doing better than many exiled men who never recovered from losing their provider role and social status. He said some men couldn't handle the loss of identity and just gave up. My father was fighting his way back slowly, and that took real strength. I told Eli I was proud of him, even though our relationship was still strained. Eli said healing took time for everyone, and I shouldn't expect too much too fast. My father and I still barely talked, but watching him engage with the community again gave me hope we might eventually repair what got broken. 3 months after our exile, Sebastian held another meeting at the community center. The room filled quickly because everyone knew this was important. Sebastian stood at the front with Rosa beside him and announced the FBI was ready to move forward with the case. They would be making arrests within the next few weeks. The exile community erupted in cautious celebration. People hugged and cried, and some just sat in stunned silence. This was what we'd been working toward for years, but everyone was afraid to hope too much in case something went wrong. Rosa stood up and warned us that legal cases were unpredictable, and we needed to prepare for a long fight. The founding families would hire expensive lawyers and try every tactic to avoid consequences. She said we should expect the process to take months or even years, but the evidence was overwhelming, and the federal prosecutors were confident. Sebastian explained the charges included racketeering, fraud, theft, and manslaughter. Each founding family leader faced decades in prison if convicted. Wallace asked when the arrests would happen, and Sebastian said he couldn't give exact dates for security reasons. My father asked what would happen to the old town, and Sebastian said new leadership would have to be established. The current system would be dismantled completely. I sat there trying to process that the people who destroyed us would actually face real consequences. It didn't feel real yet, but it was happening. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Rosa asking if I'd give a formal deposition for the FBI case. She explained it meant traveling to the federal building and being interviewed on video by prosecutors. The deposition would become official evidence used in court. I agreed immediately, even though the idea terrified me. My parents said they'd come with me for support, and Rodrigo offered to wait in the lobby. The morning of the deposition, I barely slept. We drove to the federal building in the city and went through security. A prosecutor named Michelle met us and explained the process. She said they'd ask detailed questions about everything I witnessed over 5 years. I should answer honestly and take my time. The deposition room had cameras and recording equipment. Michelle and another prosecutor sat across from me with stacks of documents. They started with basic questions about when I first noticed the exile system and how it worked. Then they asked about specific exiles I witnessed. I described my best friend's family getting chosen when I was 13. I explained watching from my window as he loaded garbage bags into their van. I admitted ducking below the window when he waved goodbye because I was too scared to respond. Describing that cowardice out loud was the hardest part. Michelle asked why I was scared, and I explained that helping exiled families meant your own family would be chosen next. She asked if that rule was enforced, and I described the sheriff's department surrounding exiled homes to prevent anyone from approaching. The questions continued for 4 hours. They asked about the Hendersons and Johnry's family, and the patterns I noticed about founding families never being chosen. I explained how I tracked which families got exiled, and realized the founding families were immune, despite obvious rule violations. Michelle showed me documents and asked me to verify information. Every answer felt important, like I was building the case one detail at a time. When we finally finished, I felt exhausted, but also proud. I contributed something real to holding the founding families accountable. Sebastian met with me after the deposition, while my parents waited in the lobby. He said my testimony about recognizing the founding family pattern was crucial evidence of systematic corruption. The fact that I noticed the pattern at 17 made it even more powerful. If a teenager could see the rigging, then the adults definitely knew and chose to stay silent. He said my age when I started documenting the pattern proved how obvious the corruption was. My testimony would help establish that the entire town enabled the founding families through willful ignorance. Sebastian thanked me for my courage in coming forward, and I almost laughed because I didn't feel courageous. I felt like I was finally making up for years of cowardice. He told me courage wasn't about never being scared. It was about doing the right thing despite the fear. I left the federal building feeling something I hadn't felt since our exile. Pride. Maybe I contributed something meaningful despite all my past failures. Maybe speaking up now mattered, even though I stayed silent for so long. Rodrigo met me in the lobby and gave me a fist bump. My parents looked proud and relieved. On the drive home, my father said he was impressed by how I handled the deposition. It was the first real compliment he'd given me since our exile, and I didn't know how to respond, so I just said thanks. My mother reached back and squeezed my hand. We drove back to the exile town in silence, but it felt different from the heavy silence of those first weeks. This silence had hope in it. The week after my deposition, Rosa started organizing workshops at the community center about what to expect when the arrests happened. She stood at the front of the room with printed handouts about managing anxiety and dealing with reporters. About 30 people showed up, mostly parents who looked nervous and excited at the same time. Rosa explained that when the FBI moved forward, there would be media attention, and everyone needed to prepare for how that might feel. She talked about trauma triggers and how seeing the founding families on TV might bring up hard memories. My mother sat next to me taking notes like this was a college class. Rosa said we should decide now whether we wanted to talk to reporters or stay private, that both choices were valid. She handed out a sheet with tips for handling interview questions if we chose to speak publicly. Vaughn raised his hand and asked what would happen to the founding family's properties and businesses once they were arrested. Rosa said the legal process would determine that, but restitution for stolen assets was part of the federal case. People started asking questions all at once about timelines and court dates and whether we'd have to testify again. Rosa held up her hands and said the FBI would contact people individually as needed. After the workshop ended, my mother stayed to talk with Rosa about my sister. I heard her ask whether she should tell my sister about the arrests before they happened or wait until after. Rosa suggested preparing my sister gently so the news wouldn't be a complete shock. My mother nodded but looked worried. 3 days later, my mother drove to the facility to visit my sister. I offered to come along, but my mother said she needed to do this alone. She left early in the morning and didn't come back until dinner time. When she walked through the door, her eyes were red and swollen. My father asked what happened, and my mother just shook her head. She sat at the kitchen table and stared at her hands. I got her a glass of water and waited. Eventually, she said my sister had a panic attack when she heard about the arrests. My mother explained that my sister started hyperventilating and saying the founding families would find a way to hurt us, even from prison. The therapist had to come in and give my sister medication to calm her down. My mother kept apologizing to the therapist, saying she shouldn't have brought it up. The therapist told her it wasn't her fault, that my sister needed to process this information eventually. My mother cried the whole drive home. She looked at me across the table and said she felt like she kept making things worse for my sister. My father reached over and took her hand, but didn't say anything. That evening, Rosa stopped by to check on my mother. She sat with her for over an hour talking quietly. I heard Rosa say that healing wasn't a straight line, that my sister would have setbacks and breakthroughs and more setbacks. Rosa said the important thing was that we kept showing up for my sister, even when it was hard. My mother thanked her, and Rosa hugged her before leaving. The next afternoon, Thea came over and asked if I wanted to go for a walk. We headed down the main street of the Exiled town, past the community center and the small library someone had organized in the converted garage. Thea was quiet for a while before she asked what I thought would happen after the arrests. I said I didn't know, that everything felt uncertain. She stopped walking and turned to face me. She asked if I would ever want to go back to the old town if we had the chance. The question caught me off guard. I thought about our old house and my old school and the streets I grew up on. Then I thought about neighbors watching from windows while we packed trash bags, and my girlfriend refusing to look at me. I told Thea I didn't think I could go back there. She nodded and said she felt the same way. She said the old town threw us away like we were garbage, and she would never forgive that. I understood what she meant. The exile community felt more like home than the old town ever did, because people here actually helped each other. Thea took my hand and said this place was ours in a way the old town never was. We built it together from nothing, and nobody could take that away from us. I squeezed her hand, and we kept walking. She started talking about maybe going to community college together next year if we could afford it. I said that sounded good. We walked all the way to the edge of town where new houses were still being built. Thea said the exile community kept growing and getting stronger while the old town rotted from corruption. I realized she was right. Getting exiled felt like the end of everything, but maybe it actually saved us from becoming like the people who stayed. 5 months after our exile, I woke up to my phone buzzing with text messages. The first one was from Rodrigo saying it was happening. I didn't understand what he meant until I opened the next message. FBI agents were raiding the founding family's homes right now. Someone in the exile community had a police scanner and was listening to the chatter. I jumped out of bed and ran to tell my parents. My father was already awake watching the news on his laptop. The local station had a reporter outside one of the founding family houses, showing FBI agents leading someone out in handcuffs. My mother came into the room and gasped. The news anchor said federal agents were executing arrest warrants for 5 people on charges, including racketeering, fraud, theft, and manslaughter. My father turned up the volume. The reporter said the arrests were connected to a systematic scheme involving property seizure and civil rights violations. My phone kept buzzing with messages from people in the exile community. Eli sent a message saying everyone should meet at the community center. My mother was crying, but this time it looked different, like relief mixed with disbelief. We got dressed quickly and drove to the community center. The parking lot was already full and people were gathering inside. Everyone was talking at once, pulling up news articles on their phones and showing each other. Wallace stood near the front, looking stunned. Rosa was there with Sebastian, who must have driven down after the arrests happened. Eli called for everyone's attention and said this was the moment we'd been working toward for years. The founding families were finally facing consequences for what they'd done. The room erupted in applause, and some people were crying. Eli reminded us that this was just the beginning, that the legal process would take time, and we needed to stay strong. Sebastian stood up and confirmed that all 5 founding family leaders were in federal custody. He said the evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecutors were confident about the case. People started asking questions about what happened next, and Sebastian explained about arraignments and bail hearings and trial dates. I looked around the room at all these families who'd lost everything and fought back. It felt surreal that we'd actually done it. Within an hour, the local news station was calling the Exile community asking for interviews. Eli's phone wouldn't stop ringing. He gathered a small group, including Rosa, Wallace, and a few other community leaders to discuss how to handle media requests. I sat in the back of the room listening. Rosa said we needed to control our own narrative instead of letting the founding family's lawyers spin the story. Eli agreed and said we should be selective about who we talked to. Someone suggested we only speak to reporters who seemed genuinely interested in understanding what happened, not just looking for sensational headlines. Wallace said he wanted to talk about his wife, that people needed to know the exile system killed her. Rosa nodded and said personal stories would be powerful. Eli looked around the room and his eyes landed on me. He asked if I would be willing to do an interview. My stomach dropped. He said my story about noticing the founding family pattern as a teenager would resonate with people. I looked at my parents, and my father nodded slightly. Thea squeezed my hand. I told Eli I would think about it. After the meeting broke up, I talked with my parents and Thea about whether I should do the interview. My mother said it was my choice, but she thought it could help people understand what we went through. Thea said I should do it if I felt comfortable, that my perspective mattered. I spent the rest of the day thinking about it. That night I texted Eli and said I would do the interview. 2 days later, a reporter from a regional news station came to the Exile community. Eli had arranged for several people to be interviewed, including me, Wallace, and a few others. The reporter was a woman in her 30s who seemed genuinely concerned about our story. She set up cameras in the community center and interviewed Wallace first. I waited my turn, feeling more nervous than I'd felt during the FBI deposition. When it was my turn, the reporter asked me to sit down and just tell my story naturally. She started by asking when I first noticed something was wrong with the exile system. I took a deep breath and told her about being 13 when my best friend's family got exiled. I described watching from my window as he loaded garbage bags into their van and how I ducked below the window when he waved goodbye because I was too scared. The reporter's expression changed, and she asked why I was scared. I explained that helping exiled families meant your own family would be chosen next. I told her about the Hendersons and Johnry's family and how I started tracking which families got exiled when I was 17. I explained that I noticed the founding families never appeared on the list, despite obvious problems. The reporter asked specific questions about how the voting system worked, and I described the locked ballot box and private vote counting with no verification. I talked about my father's promotion and our exile 3 months later. The reporter looked angry by the end of the interview. She thanked me and said this was important journalism. That evening, the story aired on the regional news. I watched myself on TV describing the corruption, and it felt strange seeing my face and hearing my voice. The reporter had edited it well, using my testimony alongside Wallace's and others to show the pattern of abuse. Rodrigo texted me saying I did great. My parents looked proud. Thea hugged me and said I was brave for speaking up. The next morning, the story had spread to other news outlets. The old town was all over the news, with reporters interviewing residents and town council members. I watched the coverage online and felt angry. Some residents were claiming they never knew about the rigged votes, that they trusted the system. One woman said she was shocked to learn the founding families had been manipulating everything. I wanted to scream at the screen because that was a lie. Everyone knew. They saw families get exiled for competing with founding family businesses. They watched people beg and get dragged away. They just didn't care as long as it wasn't their family. The remaining town council members were scrambling to distance themselves from the founding families. One council member said in an interview that he had concerns about the exile system, but felt powerless to change it. Another said the founding families operated independently and the council had no oversight. It was all deflection and excuses. The reporter asked why the council never investigated the pattern of founding families never being exiled. The council member stammered and said he never noticed that pattern. I threw my phone across the room. Thea picked it up and handed it back to me. She said watching them lie was infuriating, but we had the truth on our side. The evidence was overwhelming, and the whole country was watching now. Wallace's interview aired that afternoon on national news. He sat in front of the camera and talked about his wife with raw emotion that made my chest hurt. He explained how she had cancer and needed treatment only available at the local hospital. He described their exile and how they ended up 3 states away with no insurance and no money. He said his wife died 2 weeks later in a charity ward because the exile system stripped them of everything. The reporter asked what he would say to the founding families. Wallace looked directly at the camera and said they murdered his wife through systematic cruelty disguised as community standards. He said exile wasn't just corruption, it was manslaughter, and he hoped they spent the rest of their lives in prison thinking about all the people they destroyed. The interview went viral. News outlets across the country picked it up. Suddenly, the exile system wasn't just a local corruption story, it was a national scandal about systematic abuse and deadly consequences. The founding family's lawyers tried to respond by saying the exile system was legal, and they weren't responsible for what happened after families left town. But Wallace's testimony was devastating, and nobody was buying their excuses. I watched Wallace on TV and saw a man who had turned his worst loss into the strongest weapon for justice. He channeled all his grief and rage into making sure everyone understood what the founding families had done. I felt proud to know him and grateful he was fighting for all of us. My sister's therapist called my mother the next day. My mother put the phone on speaker so we could all hear. The therapist said my sister had seen the news coverage and something shifted during therapy. She was finally starting to process Johnry's exile and understanding it wasn't her fault for not going with him. The therapist explained that seeing the corruption exposed publicly was helping my sister separate her own choices from the system's cruelty. My sister was beginning to understand that Johnry's exile was systematic targeting, not a reflection of her love or loyalty. The therapist said my sister still had a long way to go, but this was real progress. My mother started crying with relief. She asked if she could visit my sister, and the therapist said yes, that my sister specifically asked to see her. My mother drove to the facility that afternoon and came back looking lighter than she had in months. She said my sister hugged her and thanked her for fighting back against the founding families. My sister told her that watching people stand up and tell the truth made her feel less alone. Maybe justice could be healing even before it was complete. 2 days after the arrests, the founding families posted bail. The news showed them leaving the courthouse with their lawyers. The exile community erupted in anger. People gathered at the community center demanding to know how they could be released so quickly. Sebastian explained that bail was normal in federal cases, and the founding families weren't considered flight risks. Rosa reminded everyone that posting bail didn't mean they were free, just that they could await trial outside of jail. The founding families' lawyers immediately launched a PR campaign. They held a press conference claiming the exile system was democratic and legal, that their clients were being persecuted for maintaining community standards. One lawyer said the founding families were pillars of the community who'd served for decades. Another said the federal charges were overreach and they would fight them vigorously. I watched the press conference feeling sick. These people had destroyed dozens of families, and they were acting like victims. The lawyer claimed the exile votes were legitimate and transparent. He said if people had problems with the system, they should have raised concerns through proper channels instead of making false accusations to federal authorities. Rosa turned off the TV and told everyone to breathe. She said powerful people always deny and deflect when they're caught. She reminded us that the evidence was overwhelming and the federal prosecutors were prepared for these tactics. Sebastian added that the founding family's PR campaign wouldn't matter in court, where actual evidence would be presented. The lawyers could spin whatever story they wanted for the media, but they couldn't spin away documented vote rigging, falsified records, and systematic targeting. Eli stood up and said we needed to stay focused. The arrests were just the first step. The real fight was coming, and we had to be ready. 6 months crawled by in the exile community while the FBI built their case. The prosecutor's office called me 3 weeks before the hearing date. They needed me to testify about the founding family pattern I'd noticed. My hands shook when I hung up the phone. Eli found me sitting on the community center steps, staring at nothing. He sat down next to me and didn't say anything for a while. Finally, he told me I could do this, that my testimony mattered. I wanted to believe him, but the thought of seeing those council leaders again made my stomach hurt. Thea drove with me to the courthouse on the morning of the hearing. Rodrigo came too, sitting in the back seat making stupid jokes to keep me from panicking. My parents followed in their car. The courthouse was this massive stone building that made me feel small just looking at it. We parked and walked toward the entrance. That's when I saw them. The 5 founding family leaders standing with their lawyers on the courthouse steps. They looked older than I remembered, but still carried themselves like they owned everything. One of them glanced my way, and his eyes went cold. My hands started shaking so hard I had to shove them in my pockets. Thea grabbed my arm and squeezed. Rodrigo moved closer on my other side. We walked past the founding families without saying anything. Inside the courthouse, my parents found seats in the gallery. My mother looked terrified. My father's jaw was clenched tight. Thea squeezed my hand one more time before I had to go wait in the witness room. Rodrigo gave me a fist bump and told me to destroy them. The prosecutor came to prep me one last time. She was this sharp woman in her 40s who'd been working the case for months. She reminded me to speak clearly, answer only what was asked, and don't let the defense lawyers rattle me. I nodded, but my mouth was too dry to talk. When they called me to testify, I walked into that courtroom on legs that barely worked. The judge sat behind this huge wooden bench looking down at everything. The jury box was full of people staring at me. The founding family leaders sat at the defense table with 3 lawyers. I took the witness stand and they swore me in. My voice cracked when I said I'd tell the truth. The prosecutor started with easy questions. My name, my age, how long I'd lived in the old town. Then she asked me to describe what I'd noticed about the exile system. I took a breath and started talking. I explained how I'd been 13 when my best friend's family got exiled, how I watched it happen again at 15 with the Hendersons, how my sister's boyfriend Johnry got taken away, how I started keeping track of which families was chosen and why. The prosecutor asked me what pattern I noticed. I looked right at the founding family leaders and said they never got exiled. Not once in 50 years. Not even when their kids broke rules or their businesses had problems. The defense lawyers objected, but the judge told me to continue. I explained how the founding families controlled the ballot box and the counting, how they announced results with no way to verify anything, how 3 months after my father got promoted over a founding family member's son, our name got called. The prosecutor showed me documents, my own notes from years of watching the exile votes, records Vaughn had compiled showing which families owned businesses and which got exiled. The pattern was right there in black and white. Anyone who competed with founding family power got removed. The defense lawyer stood up for cross-examination. He was this older guy in an expensive suit who looked at me like I was dirt. He asked if I was bitter about being exiled. I said yes. He asked if I wanted revenge. I said I wanted justice. He tried to make me sound like some angry teenager making up conspiracies. But every time he pushed, I pointed back to the documentation. The numbers didn't lie. Founding families never got exiled despite obvious violations. Everyone else got removed for tiny mistakes. The judge kept looking more and more angry as I answered questions. His expression shifted from neutral to disgusted. When the defense lawyer suggested I couldn't possibly understand the complexity of community governance at my age, the judge actually interrupted. He said a teenager who could track systematic corruption for 5 years clearly understood plenty. The defense lawyer sat down looking frustrated. The prosecutor asked me one final question. Did I believe the exile system was fair and democratic? I said no. It was a rigged selection process disguised as voting, designed to remove anyone who threatened founding family power. They dismissed me, and I walked back to my seat. My legs were shaking, but I'd done it. I'd told the truth in front of everyone. Thea grabbed my hand as I sat down. My parents were crying in the gallery. The next witness was Wallace. I'd seen him angry before, but this was different. He walked to that stand with this cold determination that made the whole courtroom go quiet. The prosecutor asked him to describe what happened to his family. Wallace's voice didn't shake at all. He explained how they got exiled 8 years ago for his teenage son's minor shoplifting charge, how his wife had stage 3 cancer and needed treatment only available at the local hospital, how exile stripped them of insurance and access to care. The courtroom was completely silent as Wallace described driving 3 states away with his dying wife, finding a charity ward that would take her, watching her deteriorate without proper treatment, holding her hand when she died 2 weeks after exile. His voice finally cracked on that last part. The defense lawyers objected, saying the exile itself was legal and they weren't responsible for what happened after families left town. Their lawyer actually said that out loud, that they weren't responsible for a woman dying because exile took away her cancer treatment. The judge's face went hard. He told the defense to sit down and let the witness finish. Wallace looked at each founding family leader one by one. He said their legal system murdered his wife as surely as if they'd pulled a trigger. The defense had no good response to that. They tried to argue the exile was within their authority, that health outcomes weren't their concern. But you could see the jury's faces. They weren't buying it. Over the next several weeks, other exiled families testified. The pattern became impossible to deny. A factory worker who reported safety violations got exiled 3 months later. A teacher who questioned the school budget got removed for alleged moral failure. A store owner whose business competed with founding family shops got targeted for tax issues that turned out to be fabricated. The prosecutors presented evidence of vote rigging, falsified ballots with the same handwriting, digital records showing the founding families met privately before each exile vote, email chains discussing which families to target next, bank records proving they profited from seized property. Witness after witness described the systematic corruption. The founding family's defense started crumbling. Their lawyers kept trying to claim everything was legal and democratic, but the evidence was overwhelming. The FBI had documented 50 years of fraud, theft, and coordinated targeting. My father testified on a Tuesday morning. I sat in the gallery watching him walk to the stand. He looked nervous, but determined. The prosecutor asked him to describe his promotion at the factory. My father explained how he'd worked there for 15 years, how he got promoted to supervisor over a founding family member's son who had worse performance reviews and less experience. How 3 months later, our family name got called for exile. The prosecutor asked if anyone told him why. My father's voice was steady when he answered. His supervisor pulled him aside the day before exile and said the promotion threatened the wrong people, that he should have known better than to take a job a founding family wanted. The defense lawyers tried to suggest my father was a bad employee making excuses, but the prosecutor had his work records, 15 years of excellent reviews, safety awards, efficiency commendations. The promotion was completely justified by merit. The defense had nothing. I watched my father sit there and tell the truth about what they'd done to us. He wasn't broken anymore. He was standing up to the people who destroyed our lives. The defense called witnesses from the old town who claimed the exile system was fair and democratic. Regular residents who said they trusted the council's vote counting, that everything seemed legitimate. But under cross-examination, they all fell apart. The prosecutor asked each one if they'd ever seen the actual ballots being counted. None of them had. She asked if they'd ever verified the vote totals. They hadn't. She asked if they'd ever questioned why founding families never got exiled despite obvious rule violations. They admitted they'd noticed, but never said anything. The prosecutor systematically destroyed their credibility. She showed how the entire town enabled corruption through willful ignorance, how people chose comfort over justice, how everyone knew something was wrong but stayed silent as long as it wasn't their family being destroyed. Some of the witnesses looked ashamed as they realized their own complicity. Others got defensive and angry, but none of them could explain away the evidence. 7 months after our exile, the jury came back with guilty verdicts on every charge: racketeering, fraud, theft, manslaughter. The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration from the exiled families. People were crying and hugging. My mother grabbed my father and they held each other. Thea was crying next to me. Rodrigo had this huge grin on his face. The founding family leaders sat frozen at their table. Their lawyers were already talking about appeals, but you could see it was over. They'd been caught. The judge's sentencing remarks were brutal. He called the exile system a systematic violation of civil rights disguised as democracy. He said in 30 years on the bench, he'd never encountered such a cruel and calculated scheme. He looked at the founding family leaders and told them they'd destroyed dozens of families, caused multiple deaths, and corrupted an entire town's moral foundation. The sentences came down hard. The council leader got 25 years in federal prison. The others got 15 to 20 years each. The judge ordered full restitution of all property seized from exiled families over 50 years. The financial judgment was in the millions. It meant selling off the founding family's businesses and assets. Everything they'd built on stolen property would be taken apart and returned. It wasn't perfect justice. Nothing could bring back Wallace's wife, or undo my sister's breakdown, or give me back those years of fear. But it was real accountability. Substantial consequences. The people who destroyed us were going to prison for decades. The old town was forced to dissolve the exile system immediately. The remaining council members resigned in disgrace. Federal oversight was mandated for new elections and governance reforms. Some exiled families talked about returning to reclaim their property. Most decided against it. The town was too damaged by what happened there. The exile community we built was genuinely better. My family received our restitution check on a Thursday afternoon. The amount wasn't the full value of everything they took, but it was enough to start rebuilding financially. My father opened the envelope and just stared at the number. Then he started crying. Not happy tears exactly. More like the overwhelming reality that we'd survived and fought back and won. My mother immediately called my sister's treatment facility to arrange better care options. She'd been waiting months to afford the programs my sister really needed. Now, we could actually help her. I suggested we invest some of the money in the exile community's development. This place had saved us when we had nothing. We should help make it even better for the families still arriving. I finished my senior year at the Exile Community School in May. The building was small compared to the Old Town School, but the teachers actually cared about us instead of just pushing us through the system. Bridget ran the graduation ceremony in the community center gymnasium, and about 30 people showed up. My parents sat in the front row with my sister between them. She looked tired but stable, her medication keeping her steady enough to sit through the ceremony without breaking down. Rodrigo walked across the makeshift stage first, then Thea, then me. Bridget handed me my diploma and hugged me tight. She gave a speech about how we'd all survived something that should have destroyed us, and now we were stronger than most people would ever be. My mother started crying halfway through. My father put his arm around her and pulled her close. My sister reached over and took my mother's hand. Watching them sit together like that, supporting each other instead of falling apart, felt like proof we'd actually made it through the worst part. The ceremony lasted 40 minutes. Afterward, people ate cake and took pictures. Rodrigo's parents congratulated me. Wallace shook my hand and told me I should be proud. Thea kissed me in front of everyone, and my sister smiled for the first time in months. We drove home together in the van we'd arrived in, the same beat-up vehicle the old town gave us with just enough gas to reach the county line. My father had fixed it up over the past year, replaced the transmission, and painted over the rust. It ran smooth now, instead of rattling like it might fall apart any second. Thea came over the next evening and we sat on the porch talking about fall. She'd gotten accepted to the community college 20 minutes away, same as me and Rodrigo. Her parents wanted her to apply to bigger schools farther from the exile town, places with better programs and more opportunities. She told them no. This place saved us when we had nothing, and we weren't going to abandon it now that things were getting better. We wanted to stay and help make it stronger. Rodrigo showed up an hour later with pizza from the place his father managed. We ate on the porch and joked about being the exile community's second generation, the kids who grew up here instead of just arriving broken and scared. Rodrigo said we had a responsibility to make sure nothing like the old town system ever happened again, anywhere. Thea said we should start a nonprofit to document exile systems in other places and help families fight back. I said we should focus on finishing college first, but the idea stuck with me. We could actually do something meaningful with what happened to us. We could turn our trauma into something that helped other people, instead of just carrying it around forever. My father got hired as a supervisor at a manufacturing plant in the city 30 minutes north. The job paid better than his old position at the factory in the old town, and the company actually promoted people based on merit instead of family connections. He came home the day he got the offer and told my mother while she was making dinner. She dropped the spoon she was holding and hugged him, so tight I thought she might break his ribs. He still had hard days where the trauma came back and he couldn't get out of bed. Some mornings he just stared at the ceiling for an hour before he could face going to work. But most days he was genuinely okay, rebuilding his sense of who he was beyond the man who lost everything. My mother told me one night that she was proud of how he fought through the darkness instead of letting it consume him completely. She said a lot of exiled men never recovered from losing their role as providers and protectors. My father was one of the lucky ones who found his way back. My mother started going to exile community organizing meetings 3 times a week. She helped coordinate support for newly arrived families, making sure they had food and clothes and someone to talk to who understood what they were going through. She worked with Rosa on advocacy projects, pushing for laws that would prevent exile systems from operating in other towns. The work gave her purpose beyond just surviving each day. The depression that nearly destroyed her after our exile had lifted enough that she could function and help other people. She wasn't the same person she was before we got exiled. That version of my mother died the day the council called our name. But this new version was stronger in ways that actually mattered, focused on mutual aid instead of maintaining appearances. She told me once that losing everything taught her what was real and what was performance. The old town ran on performance. The exile community ran on people actually helping each other. My sister got discharged from residential treatment in June and moved into a supervised apartment 10 minutes from our house. The apartment had 2 bedrooms, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom that barely fit one person. She shared the space with another woman from her treatment program, someone who understood medication schedules and therapy appointments and the daily work of staying stable. My sister got a part-time job at the community center, helping with filing and answering phones 4 hours a day. The work was simple, but it gave her structure and a reason to get out of bed. She was still fragile. Some days she couldn't handle being around people and had to call in sick. Some nights she had panic attacks about genre and needed to call her therapist for emergency support. But she was rebuilding her life piece by piece, instead of just existing in a fog of medication and supervision. She came over for dinner one Sunday and told me she was proud of me for testifying against the founding families. I told her I was proud of her for surviving everything that happened. We both cried a little, and my mother made us eat more food than we wanted, because that's how she showed love now. Wallace started a foundation in his wife's name to help exiled families access medical care and legal support. He'd been saving money from his job at the hardware store, and combined with donations from other exile community members, he had enough to officially register as a non-profit. The foundation office was just a room in the community center with a desk and a computer, but it was real and functional. Wallace spent every evening there, organizing resources and connecting families with doctors and lawyers who worked on sliding-scale fees. I volunteered to help with fundraising and outreach, making calls and writing grant applications. Wallace told me one night that channeling his grief into helping others was the only thing that made his wife's death feel less meaningless. If he could save even one family from losing someone the way he lost her, then maybe her death counted for something. I understood what he meant. Trauma could either destroy you completely or become fuel for making sure it didn't happen to other people. Wallace chose the second option, and watching him work inspired me to do the same. Agent Donovan visited the exile community in July for a final meeting with everyone who contributed to the case. He drove out from the federal building and met us at the community center. About 40 people showed up, all the families who'd given testimony or helped with documentation over the past 3 years. Donovan stood at the front of the room and thanked us for our patience and courage. He said the federal prosecution was one of the most straightforward corruption cases he'd worked in his career. Our systematic documentation made it impossible for the founding families to escape accountability. Every piece of evidence we collected, every testimony we gave, every pattern we identified built an airtight case that no defense lawyer could break apart. He walked over to me specifically and shook my hand. He said my testimony about recognizing the founding family pattern when I was 17 was crucial evidence of systematic corruption. If a teenager could see the rigging that clearly, the adults definitely knew what was happening. I felt genuinely proud for the first time since our exile, like maybe I contributed something meaningful to justice instead of just surviving. Some people from the old town started reaching out to apologize after the convictions became public. Letters arrived at the community center addressed to exiled families, full of explanations about fear and pressure and not knowing what to do. Phone calls came through asking for forgiveness and understanding. The exile community had mixed reactions. Some people accepted the apologies and tried to rebuild connections with former neighbors and friends. They said everyone was trapped in the system together and the founding families were the real enemy. Others refused to forgive people who only cared now that the powerful were held accountable. Thea was in the second group. She told me she didn't want apologies from people who watched her family get destroyed and did nothing. Their fear didn't excuse their silence. Their complicity wasn't forgivable just because the system was cruel. I was somewhere in the middle. I understood fear and how it made people act against their own values. I remembered ducking below the window when my best friend waved goodbye, too scared to acknowledge him. But I also couldn't forget watching neighbors close their curtains while we packed garbage bags, turning away from our suffering because helping us might put their own families at risk. Understanding why people acted badly didn't mean I had to forgive them or let them back into my life. My former girlfriend from the old town sent me a letter in August. The envelope had my name written in her handwriting, and I almost threw it away without opening it. But Thea told me I should read it and decide how I felt afterward, instead of avoiding it completely. The letter was 4 pages long. She explained she was scared when my family got exiled, afraid that standing with me would get her family targeted next. She was ashamed of turning away from me that day. She thought about it constantly, wished she'd been braver, regretted not at least looking at me when they made us leave. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just wanted me to know she understood what she did was wrong, and she was sorry. I read the letter twice, then wrote back a short response. I thanked her for the apology and told her I appreciated her honesty. But I also explained I'd moved on with my life and found someone who actually cared about me enough to stand with me when things got hard. Closing that chapter with clarity instead of bitterness felt good. I didn't need to forgive her or hate her. I just needed to move forward. The old town held a public ceremony in September, where remaining residents formally apologized to exiled families. They rented the town hall where the exile votes used to happen and were invited everyone who'd been forced out over the past 50 years. The new town council gave speeches about acknowledging complicity and learning from mistakes. They promised to build a memorial for families destroyed by the exile system. Some exiled families attended the ceremony. They wanted to hear the apologies and witness the old town taking responsibility. But most families, including mine, chose not to go. We didn't need their apologies to move forward with our lives. Eli said the ceremony was more for the old town's healing than ours. They needed to process their guilt and complicity. We'd already done our healing work in the community we built together, supporting each other through trauma and building something better than what was taken from us. My family stayed home that day. We had dinner together, all 5 of us, including my sister. My father grilled burgers in the backyard. My mother made potato salad. My sister brought cookies from the bakery near her apartment. Thea came over and helped set the table. We ate outside while the sun set, talking about normal things like work and school and weekend plans. The old town ceremony happened 40 miles away, but we didn't think about it much. We were too busy living our actual lives in the place that saved us. A year after our exile, Eli called me into the community center office and handed me a phone number on a folded piece of paper. My best friend's family had reached out through the Exile network. They'd been living 3 states away this whole time, working in a warehouse district and renting a tiny apartment. They had no idea about the FBI investigation or the convictions or any of it. They just heard through another exiled family that we were here and wanted to reconnect. I stared at the number for 10 minutes before I could make myself dial. My hands shook so bad I had to try 3 times. When my best friend answered, his voice sounded exactly the same but also completely different. Deeper. Tired. We were both 18 now, but the last time we really talked, we were 13 years old. I apologized immediately for hiding below the window that night when he waved goodbye. The words came out in a rush. He was quiet for a long time, and I thought maybe he'd hung up. Then he said we were just kids in an impossible situation, and he forgave me years ago. He said he understood fear better than anyone. We talked for 2 hours about everything that happened to both our families. His mother had a breakdown similar to my sister's. His father worked 3 jobs to keep them fed. They survived, but barely. When I told him about the FBI case and the convictions and the restitution, he started crying. Not sad crying, but the kind where you're so relieved you can't hold it in anymore. They arranged to visit the exile community 2 weeks later, and I counted down every single day. Seeing my best friend get out of their car was overwhelming in a way I didn't expect. He looked so much older, but I could still see the kid who used to share his lunch with me in middle school. We hugged for a long time while our families stood around watching. His mother hugged my mother, and they both cried. His father shook my father's hand, and they just nodded at each other like they understood something without needing to say it. Rodrigo helped me show them around the exile town, pointing out the school and community center, and all the houses people built together. My best friend kept looking around with this expression of disbelief. He said he'd been living in a place where everyone pretended exiled families didn't exist, where mentioning the old town got you weird looks and silence. Being here with people who actually understood felt like he could breathe properly for the first time in 5 years. His family decided to move to the exile community instead of going back to the old town. They said returning to the place that destroyed them sounded like torture, even with restitution money. I helped them find a house and get furniture donated from the community storage. I showed them how the cooperative economy worked and introduced them to Eli and Rosa and Wallace. Rodrigo and I helped his younger sister enroll in the school. The cycle of mutual aid continued exactly like when my family first arrived. This is what real community looks like. People who survived trauma helping others through it, building something better than what was taken from us. My best friend and I spent hours catching up on everything we missed. 5 years of life compressed into late-night conversations on my porch. He told me about the warehouse job that destroyed his back. I told him about Thea and community college and working for Wallace's foundation. We talked about the old town and how we both still had nightmares about Exile Day. It felt like reclaiming a piece of my childhood that Exile stole. Not getting it back exactly, but finding it again in a different form. The Exile community celebrated the 1-year anniversary of the founding family's convictions with a festival that was part memorial and part celebration. Wallace organized the whole thing with help from my mother and Rosa. We set up tables in the community center parking lot, and everyone brought food. There was a memorial wall with photos and names of people who died because of the exile system. Mrs. Henderson's picture was there, Wallace's wife, a man who had a heart attack 2 days after his family got exiled, a teenage girl who took her own life after her family was destroyed. We stood in front of that wall for an hour, while people told stories about the ones we lost. It was sad, but also important. Remembering that this wasn't just about corruption and legal cases, it was about real people who suffered and died because the founding families wanted power. Then we shifted to celebrating that we survived and built something better. There was music and kids running around playing games. People laughed and danced and acted normal. I stood with my family and Thea and Rodrigo, and my best friend and I felt genuinely grateful for this community that saved us. We could have all stayed broken and isolated. Instead, we found each other and made something real. 18 months after our exile, my sister called me from her apartment sounding nervous and excited at the same time. She met someone at her support group, a guy who was dealing with his own trauma from an abusive family situation. They'd been talking for weeks, and he asked her on a real date. She wanted to know if I thought she was ready. I told her only she and her therapist could answer that. She went on the date, then another one. She moved carefully with her therapist's guidance, taking things slow and being honest about her struggles. Watching her take that risk after everything she went through with Johnry made me emotional in a way I didn't expect. She was still healing and probably always would be. The medication helped, but she still had hard days where she couldn't get out of bed. But she was living her life instead of just surviving. She told me the FBI case and convictions helped her understand that what happened to Johnry wasn't her fault or his. It was systematic cruelty by people who now faced consequences. That understanding didn't fix everything, but it gave her a framework for processing the trauma. She could separate her own choices from the system that destroyed Johnry's family. I met her boyfriend a month later, and he seemed genuinely kind, careful with her in a way that showed he understood she was fragile. They held hands and smiled at each other, and it was normal and sweet. My sister deserved normal and sweet after years of darkness. I started community college with Thea and Rodrigo in the fall semester, studying social work because I wanted to help other trauma survivors navigate recovery and justice systems. My experience with exile and the FBI case showed me that systematic change was possible when people documented abuse and fought back collectively. One person speaking up got ignored. 50 families with evidence and coordination got federal convictions. I wanted to learn how to help people organize that kind of collective action, how to build cases and gather testimony and push for accountability. Professor assignments felt meaningful because I was learning skills I would actually use to help people. Not just abstract theory, but practical tools for advocacy work. Thea was studying nonprofit management, so she could help run organizations like Wallace's Foundation. Rodrigo was doing computer science with a focus on database systems for advocacy work. The three of us studied together and complained about homework and acted like normal college students. But we also knew why we were there and what we wanted to do with our degrees. We weren't just going to the school to get jobs. We were learning how to fight systems that destroyed people like us. My father came home from work one evening and told my mother he got promoted again. This time there was no fear or retaliation, just recognition of his skills and hard work. His supervisor called him into the office and offered him a team leader position with better pay and more responsibility. My father accepted and came home with cautious pride on his face. My mother cried happy tears and hugged him for a long time. They'd both healed so much from those first broken days after exile. My mother wasn't crying constantly anymore. My father wasn't sitting in silence staring at nothing. They were genuinely rebuilding their lives and their relationship. They weren't the same people they were before, and neither was I. We were stronger in some ways and more damaged in others. But we were more genuine. We knew what real community looked like now because we built it together. We understood the difference between false friendships based on fear and real connections based on mutual support. My parents got involved in community leadership and helped plan the Exile town's continued growth. They had purpose again, and it showed in how they carried themselves. Not the false confidence of the old town where everyone pretended to be perfect. Real confidence that came from surviving something terrible and choosing to help others through it. 2 years after our exile, my family gathered for dinner in the house we were able to buy with restitution money and my father's new income. It was a real house with a yard and enough bedrooms for everyone. My sister came over with her partner, and she looked stable and happy, laughing at jokes and helping set the table and acting like a regular person instead of someone broken. My parents were genuinely happy, talking about community projects and future plans instead of dwelling on what we lost. Thea joined us because she was basically family now. She and my mother cooked together while my father grilled outside. My best friend stopped by with his family, and we all ate together on the back porch. We talked about the future instead of the past. College plans and career goals and where we wanted to live long term. Normal conversations that families have when they're not traumatized and desperate. I looked around at everyone and realized we'd actually healed. Not perfectly, and not completely. My sister still took medication and had therapy twice a week. My father still had nightmares about losing everything. I still felt shame about hiding from my best friend's goodbye. But we were genuinely healing instead of just surviving. We built real lives in a real community with people who actually cared about each other. That was more than the old town ever gave us. I'm 20 years old now, working part-time at Wallace's Foundation while finishing my degree. I've learned that justice isn't about revenge or perfect endings. The founding families are in prison serving long sentences. The exile system is destroyed and can never come back. We built something better than what we lost. A community based on actual mutual support instead of fear and competition. I still carry shame about hiding from my best friend's goodbye, and I probably always will. That moment defined my cowardice in a way I can't erase, but I turned that cowardice into courage when it mattered most. I testified in court. I helped document the abuse. I stood up to the people who destroyed us. We survived systematic cruelty, fought back, won real accountability, and built a community where people actually help each other. Wallace tells me his wife would be proud of what we accomplished. My sister tells me she's grateful I helped bring down the system that destroyed genre. My parents tell me they're proud of who I became after exile forced me to grow up fast. That's not a perfect ending, but it's a real one, and it's enough.